All right, well, welcome. Thanks, everybody, for coming to Harmonizing AI with Collaborative Data Governance and MDM. I think we have the award for the longest title and the most buzzwords in a title of any session. I'm Brian Platz. I'm co-founder, CEO of Fluree. Fluree is a data management technology company. We focus on semantics, knowledge graphs in particular, and thinking about data in this graph form to solve typical challenges. And of course, a lot of that sort of thinking will come through in some of our thoughts and approaches that we end up talking about today. I'd like to introduce Steve.
Steve Hamby, a senior semantic engineer with Vitality TechNet, a network of technologists, independent technologists that work hard problems using technology. And we work with Fluree on a particular account, and that's one of the accounts we're here to discuss.
Great. Yeah, so as far as the agenda that we have in place for today, so we'll talk about AI, but specifically what we'll categorize as data-centric AI, so how we think about data coming into the AI process and sort of where we see that evolving to. The focus here, of course, is going to be talking about, with that foundation, how we think about data governance in that world. We will discuss briefly a framework for thinking about that data governance. We're going to go through a use case where we're going to talk about pharmaceuticals and give a practical example how to apply some of these concepts. And we'll finish off with strategies and best practices. We'll leave some time at the end for questions, although happy to take questions as they arise for anyone that has them. So how do we think about this term data-centric AI? I'm sure everyone has a different way of thinking about the AI space, and it's advancing by the day. So this is how we consider the problem, and we really look at what we refer to in kind of these purple boxes here as model-centric AI, and then these green boxes here, data-centric AI, and some of the things we're seeing evolving. And as we kind of represent with that arrow on the left, we see this space evolving from really a model-centric approach, which is where a lot of the activity exists today, into a more data-centric approach. So when we say model-centric, we're talking about design time approach. And design time approach and its challenges for enterprise use, of course, is that it only knows what it knew when you designed it. It doesn't know anything current. And when we're looking to solve enterprise questions or problems, really what has that current data is our systems. So we really need to think about how do we incorporate that data from our systems, and that's really captured by this data delivery box here and some different techniques in that category. How do we capture data from our systems into the processing of using like a large language model? So a lot of the advancement and a lot of the excitement, of course, has been around ChatGPT coming out, and there's been a lot of different use cases. We're getting into more and more complex use cases around using ChatGPT. And we're starting to see now where we come into this data-centric side, which is runtime. How do we leverage the model for what it knows well, which is interacting with humans, having some reasoning capability, and how it's thinks about things, can formulate responses to questions, inject creativity, but how do we combine that with knowledge that the organization has and knowledge that the organization has in real time? So one of the more popular methods that we're starting to see or have been seeing a lot of activity around is RAG. So this is retrieving data basically at delivery time. So you're using the model to basically enable an end user to ask a question about content, about your business, whatever the case is. And instead of the model trying to figure out how to deliver that answer based on what it was trained on, and again, that training data is outdated from the moment you finish the training, even if you sort of fine tune it. Instead of trying to answer the question directly, what you teach it to do is how to go out and actually retrieve that information at inference time, at runtime, and then bring those results back in and help them then formulate the answer for the user. You're getting real-time information. You're avoiding hallucinations. Now, doing all this isn't quite simple, which is why we don't see a lot of it yet. But this is where we're seeing a lot of the activity, and I expect we're going to see a lot more of the activity in this space this year. When we think about where we even go from there, we have these next couple categories that we see this evolving into, but are very early stage. This that we label as more of a data management problem, where we're actually taking agents that are trained down here to do very specific tasks and things to actually orchestrate together to perform more complex tasks. One of the things that we're finding pretty quickly is that when we need to do complex multi-step tasks, it's difficult to train a single model to do all these things. It's actually working out a lot better to train multiple specialized models and then have them work with each other. But when they're working with each other, they need a way to coordinate around source of truth, to coordinate around data. And then, of course, getting into data AI, where there's actually some degree of intelligence about the data itself built into the model, and it's actually able to discover insights on its own. So very different than kind of when we're talking about RAG here, where we're training the model here to be able to know how to go out and get information. Way up here, we actually have models that can derive some of its own insights. So one of the big challenges we have starts to get solved using something like RAG, but we're still operating in a siloed approach. And this is where some of my bias towards leveraging sophisticated models for data and knowledge graph comes in. But ChatGPT and a lot of these more general models, they're trained on general knowledge. They don't know anything about your industry. They do not know exactly how your industry views the world, how it operates, what your unique acronyms are, of course. But they have a lot of very useful sort of learning that helps it interact with your end users. So these are things that are difficult for us to train or quite expensive to train if we had to train them from scratch. So we want to leverage this general knowledge. But it's really, how do we end up bringing that company knowledge and then, importantly, actually layer in industry knowledge in with that general knowledge to be able to produce the best answers and the best insights possible. So, of course, some of our traditional challenges with company knowledge come in here that it's very siloed. It's difficult to connect these constructs together. And that's a key challenge that I think most organizations are somewhere on the journey of trying to address. But importantly, even if you do address it, now to really connect it into industry knowledge and general knowledge requires somehow linking that company knowledge into those concepts. And this, of course, I think is where a specialty around knowledge graphs comes in, where we can actually use models and semantics to be able to start to create these ties together so we can actually look at all of these things as a single body of knowledge, as opposed to a bunch of silos, which isn't going to help us a whole lot except for answering very siloed sort of questions. If I have questions about a customer and my customer data is already mastered, or it's all in Salesforce or whatever the case may be, it can answer that. But it can't link information about my customer to perhaps information that might be going on about that account in the industry. And it can't really link that information into general knowledge without some sort of broader approach. So focusing on a data-centric approach to AI, I think becomes, a logical solution to solve these problems. They solve a lot of other problems as well, of course, sustainable and reusable data. One of the big focuses that we see organizations, and in fact, we heard from Volvo, I think just before, around the challenge of trying to centralize too much of this. We're big advocates of really pushing some of this responsibility to the edge. And when that manifests itself into a technology framework that starts to look like a decentralized data fabric that's able to actually dynamically pull data together at query time, have governance that can even sit at the edge if it wants, or some degree of it centralized, and be able to make it look like a holistic data network as opposed to sort of the copy and paste approach, which a lot of organizations, of course, are doing today with things like cloud data lakes. We're just copying our data, we're pasting it in, and it's outdated. It still doesn't necessarily coordinate with each other. So if we can layer a sophisticated model on top, we can actually decentralize some of this, where we can issue queries, we can actually bring together data, leave some of the governance and ownership at the edge with the business unit, and taking that a step further, leave it with your business partners and start to bring in that knowledge as well seamlessly. And obviously my passion for knowledge graphs fits in here because we have a set of standards that actually allows us to do this, that we can deploy, that can link entities and relationships and ontologies together. Another advantage then that we can do is we can lay governance directly onto that model, especially if we're thinking about a model for data that isn't necessarily just a simple taxonomy, but more like an ontology. We can start to create more sophisticated rules into different nodes within that ontology, and what we end up with is a solution where, what we say is data can defend itself. So the data ownership and governance ends up sitting in, and is able to actually allow this querying at the edge, but with a governance layer that will only allow the results to come through based on that user's permissions or role in the organization, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also have the benefits of AI explainability and provenance for all of our data being resident as well. So I mentioned my passion for knowledge graphs and solving some of these problems. And as AI comes in, it sort of gives another dimension to think about knowledge graphs in solving some of these problems. And this is actually an interesting experiment that demonstrates, and I'll walk you through it here in a second, that demonstrates that these large language models seem to have a native understanding, or a more native understanding about thinking about data in a knowledge graph than they do over traditional relational databases. And in this experiment, what we did is we took data from financial services client, all in SQL relational databases. We gave an LLM as much information we could about the schema. So we gave it SQL DDLs, gave it some context. This is all sort of zero shot, meaning we're not training a model, we're just using an out-of-the-box model. And we asked it a series of 16 questions. They're not, the most difficult questions in the world, but some of these questions require joins across multiple tables, or in some cases, 5, 6, 7 tables to produce a single answer. And we were able to get about 20% of the questions right. The LLM got 20% of the questions right. And to be specific, what we're asking here is we're giving a human question, and we're asking the LLM to generate SQL, which then can go out and get executed against a real-time data source and bring back the current accurate information. By taking the identical data and just representing it in OWL as an ontology, and asking it, instead of generating SQL, generate Sparkle. So now we're doing a graph query. We're already at a 3x improvement. The same underlying data. We haven't changed a thing to the data, we haven't cleansed the data, we haven't remodeled the data. We're just describing the same way that you would model a relational database in a bunch of tables, but we're just describing it a little bit differently and asking it to ask those questions a little bit differently. Pretty dramatic jump up in improvement, but still not really useful. Like, we're not going to roll this out to the business when it's only getting 60% of the question we're asking it correct at a time. So then by taking just the next step in a little bit more effort to refine the model, instead of just sort of layering a graph on top of SQL data, if we represented that data as a graph to begin with, we would have approached it slightly differently. So let's take that opportunity and sort of remodel our data. The identical data, we're not cleansing it or doing anything at that point. We're just remodeling it as a graph. But this is going to take a little bit more effort. This middle step here takes basically 0 effort. So a little bit more effort, and we're almost at the 90% accuracy rate. 0 shot, no additional training. And it really reinforces this notion that these LLMs seem to have a much more native understanding when data is represented in this form. I think it makes a lot of sense, because if I asked all of us to walk up to a whiteboard and actually model out our data, you'd likely end up actually drawing a graph. You wouldn't end up drawing a bunch of relational tables with joins, et cetera. You'd sort of draw out circles and you'd connect things. And this knowledge seems to sort of represent that. There's also some exciting activity around new foundation models that are based on graphs that can sort of take learnings from other graphs and apply them to data that they've never even seen. And that's something that people are also trying to do in the sort of SQL side, and it's proving much more difficult to do it there. So we're really excited about graph, and we think it's a really native way of LLMs also being able to think about it. So how do we approach this? And this is a very simplistic framework, but it focuses on the iteration that happens. First, how do we model our data? And the model becomes important for AI for that contextual grounding. This is how we tell AI, this is how we view the world. So the AI is going to, when we're thinking about LLMs, it of course has a tremendous understanding of everything in the world, but it doesn't understand anything about our business. The model is really where we get the opportunity to describe how we think about things, how we think about our domain. And AI plays a pretty important role in that, in not only helping us to develop more sophisticated models as ontologies, but also ending up through this feedback loop, being able to provide new concepts that we're seeing as time goes on, because our businesses evolve, new things come into the world. When we think about these models, we need to think about these not as static things, but as very dynamic things that evolve over time if we're going to get the most usefulness. Of course, once we have our model, being able to map it is probably the problem that I'm guessing most of the people in this room spend the most time on. How do we actually take existing legacy data and be able to bring that into the model? We focus a lot on using supervised and unsupervised AI and being able to do that in a very fast way. Of course, you can write Python scripts, you can do lots of different approaches to ultimately map existing data you have into the model, come up with, do entity resolution, come up with golden records, et cetera. And then, of course, the consumption, which is now that we have all this, of course, it's not going to be super useful unless we make it available for people to be able to use. So not only when we think about consumption, are we leveraging the model and ideally a more human approach to our data as opposed to having them go find data sets. They want to know certain things about customers, for example. So a semantic representation of the data that sits underneath. But as I mentioned before, it also gives us an opportunity to start to apply governance at the model level so that we can dynamically restrict data based on a user, and even thinking about users' relationships to other departments or other groups dictating permissions and having that be a very dynamic thing. So I use that word dynamic a lot. So lots of times sort of the governance model and the sort of data model are thought of as things that don't change a lot. And the way we try to think about them is they actually may be changing as fast as your underlying data may be for this to become a really useful system. So we've designed around that concept. So just to recap real quickly about a data-centric approach and programmable governance. So focus on semantics, and we have great standards out there, W3C standards on how to represent data that we can actually combine data dynamically into that decentralized data fabric. And by leveraging standards, you're able to leverage anyone's technology that adheres to those standards. So we have a strong focus on those standards, being able to have that provable provenance and understand how data changes over time, where it originated from. So when we're using AI and we're answering questions, we're always able to trace back to the source and be able to provide that proof. Being able to, as I've mentioned many times, apply security at that model level, and you end up with a solution where data defends itself. So every user effectively has a virtual database in every one of these decentralized sources that when they query, it only produces results that they have the permission to see. And of course, data quality comes into that. And I'll turn it over to Steve to talk a bit about how we think about governance.
Yeah, and in addition to all the things that Brian just discussed, you might also have different models. And what I mean by this is ways of applying the data governance. And so when I think of culture in the financial services, and also we'll talk about a pharmaceutical use case, there's a regulatory aspect of it. That's typically going to be top down. But some companies will also have a very bottom-up approach. And so whether you have if you know Schneider's cultural models, it's control, competence, collaboration, and cultivation. So you may have a very cultivating type of a model where every pharmaceutical development lab has this cultivating approach, and maybe they do collaboration as well. But then certain things like maybe the ethos of the company, the regulatory, that would be global regulatory affairs, will be very top-down as approach. And so that's what we mean there. So what I'll do is talk about this use case here, a major pharmaceutical company. And what we wanted to do is, you've probably seen these slides before if you've ever worked in regulatory. $2.9 billion to develop a single product. It takes about 10.5 years. Whoops, hit the wrong button, sorry. About 10.5 years, less than 8% predicted success rate. So as soon as I start a project, 8% or 92% are likely going to fail, 8% will make it. That's basically the idea. And so there's a 8% chance that we'll make this. And then, but on the other side, the top 10 products last year made $1 billion a month, average, okay? Roughly $1 billion, not exactly, but roughly. That was the average of the top 10 products. So if I can take, and I've got little stages here, this is my discovery and development, my preclinical research, my clinical research, regulatory drug review and approval, and then my post-market drug safety. And so those are really the 5-step process that both FDA and EMA have a similar type of process like that. So if I can just carve, let's say 3 months, then you can see really quickly the discount there and the revenue that I would make there. So that was basically the business strategy behind this particular implementation. So what we wanted to do, going back to what Brian had discussed, is we've got an example of our model, process model. And this is true for any pharmaceutical. And although it'll be different, implemented different for each lab, also each company, et cetera. But this is just a basic generic process. I start with some material, I run it through some process, and out of this comes some material lot. I have some specification for how that process runs, the items on the material, what the product itself should be, and I've got some instruments that are used in the process as well. And from that, I take some samples of this material lot, and I do measurements on them to see how I match to those specifications here. Okay, so that's just kind of a simple, very simplification of an actual process. And typically, what would happen is we do all of this process work, and we collect a bunch of data. We throw it over some wall to global regulatory, and they begin to work some collaborative process to come up with a set of submissions using ECTD, Common Technical Document, and then submit that to regulatory. And so in our thought, there was a paper that was out called The Future of CMC Regulatory Submissions, and it was saying, hey, could you use structured content authoring as a way to promote a collaborative review? And so from a data governance perspective, we said, well, we need to take this model and represent it in the ontologies, as Brian was mentioning, because we want to get it into a graph format, so now we can have this Q&A session going on with generative AI, with regulatory agencies and the global regulatory. And then if we could do this, we could potentially carve those 3 months, because that's typically that one process just to go from IND into an initial submission. And so that's basically the context here. So the first thing we want to do is to take this process and model it as some set of ontologies. And so this is basically from this paper, this is the model that they came up with, defined in this paper. And it matches a lot of the things we just talked about. There's material, there's your material, there's a specification, there's specification, stability study, there, countries, regions not actually modeled on their product here, et cetera. So you get the idea that all the items on here, instrument, measurement, et cetera. Anyway, so you get an idea that all of these things are there. And so the idea then is to model this, and that goes back to the model process that Brian talked about, model everything in ontology. Second thing is we need to look at that CTD document, the one that got filed at the end. That's where we're trying to carve this 3-month process off to get this additional savings and extra income. And so basically this module, there's 5 modules to this. Module 1 we weren't really concerned with, kind of more of a table of contents, but the module 2, module 2 is the table of contents, and then it has some additional information. 3 goes heavily into quality. 4 goes heavily into non-clinical. Okay, so those particular models right there, 2, 3, and 4, those modules are the ones we're most interested in. So we looked at each one of those and did the table of contents for them, and then basically did the same type of thing. Let's model some document component. That could be this particular section or this particular paragraph, etc. And so you see module, section, paragraph. Model a document, the concept, the corpus. That would be a collection of multiple things like multiple specifications, multiple products, intermediate products, things of that nature. The metadata that comes off that, where did it come from, the lineage provenance that Brian was discussing earlier, those are all things that are important here. And then what are the requirements for the content and styling specified? So maybe I can present a table, which is very easy for me to take that graph data and automatically generate a table. But what about the prose document that needs to go in there and actually introduce it? What are the requirements for that for each section? And so those are some of the things that we needed to model there. And again, this model and these concepts are actually discussed here. This is actually from a FDA, someone, John Sunderland, who works at the FDA, had created this concept of possibly modeling the ECTD. So borrowing a lot of other people's work. So then the next thing we want to do, now that we've modeled the CTD, we've modeled our process, the next thing we need to do is map. So model, map, consume. So now we're going to map the process to the submission itself. So this is our process here. We map that to that's our representation. And now you can see here are those different sections of the ECTD and where they fit in. And this isn't all of them, it's just a select few. You saw it was a lot of paragraphs there, and I didn't want to make this slide too busy. But so that's the idea. So now should be that once I map this model to the process or to the submission, that now what I do is map my data to the model. Now, as soon as data changes over here, I've got a mapping to this model, and then a mapping to the CTD. Okay, so very simple concept here. And so I won't go through the description of all these, but things like lab notebooks, laboratory information systems, et cetera, our ERP material. And this is going to be the area that we're going to focus on here. And the idea is I want to tap into, for a particular product, tap into the material, and then look at that material and how do we apply AI to that material to be able to then automate that reporting process just for the material side, okay? And so, and to kind of give a background there, I'll give you an example. There's an analysis known as CIEF, for capillary isoelectric focusing. There's not going to be a test on this, so you don't have to remember. Analysis. We had 127 different variations of that term throughout our processes. For one of our products, you think of it as the material. In this case, it's at the product portion of the material. We had 336, I think it was, different variations of it. And so imagine at discovery, it's not been named yet. And so maybe we just call it XYZ1234. That wasn't the actual name. But some people might actually give it abbreviations of the material name. But the INN, there's a set of naming standards that when you're working, and this was a particular monoclonal antibody, and so it must end in MAB. So if you've ever seen drug products, MAB means monoclonal antibody. And so you can look at the names, and they're required to be named certain ways. Up until it gets that name, it could be known as many different things going through that initial process that we were talking about. And even intermediates could get its own name. But when it comes down to it, they're all derivatives of that final product. And so what we need to do is be able to, in that ERP system, pull all the different variations of this and get it mapped for this concept to work, because we need to be able to have this collaborative review. Okay? And so finally, what we end up with is my data mapped to the model, and then mapped to those different paragraphs, so that as soon as this data here, someone uploads some new information here or information here on some analytic that just occurred off of a sample, that information is immediately available there, batch analyses potentially, or maybe it's something related to stability data. Those paragraphs change, and now the stakeholders over there, global regulatory and our regulatory agencies, can now see that information immediately in real time, and we can get this collaborative review that we want to be able to speed up that process, make more money, cut costs for developing the product, and also improve its predicted chance of success. And so in this particular case, let's see, I don't think, so what we needed to do was be able to reduce the rework. What happens here is, if you think about lab to lab to lab, this lab does something, they upload a bunch of data to project manager. Project manager looks at it and says, yep, this is good. They mark it off on their list. But another lab gets it, they don't see all the data, they actually redo work. By putting everything in this scenario here, where we actually have the CTD generated, all the labs have that. We also have the ability to do human in the loop or on the loop to capture this expert knowledge. And this is where we were able to bring in the process that Brian's talking about with AI in the loop, and be able to do some initial prediction for those materials out of the box. We ended up with about 32%, because again, you're going to have names like C12345 or whatever. It's going to be a very low percentage. As soon as you put human on the loop, as soon as you bring in other data sets, that model rapidly increases. And I believe this was about 3 weeks that we did this particular work, and I think we got it up to 64, 65, or maybe it was even low 70, 71 in certain areas. And that's predicted success. And then the last thing is improve that therapeutic development. And we're anticipating about a 10 to 15% reduction there in that, just the regulatory filing process. And this approach is actually valid on any of those layers that I showed earlier. We just wanted to isolate it to one area. Okay. And so again, the human in the loop, on the loop, that process there, we focus on just the material side of it, but again, it can be applied anywhere. I'll turn it back to you. We've got about 10 minutes.
Yeah, so we wanted to leave a little time for any questions about the process. So we're officially open to that. Just to recap while everyone's thinking about their questions. Certainly involving humans in refining the training, and of course making that a very easy experience on the user becomes critical. So we try and get it down to thumbs up, thumbs down. We're actually using AI to really strategize itself about the types of questions it can ask the humans that are going to make the biggest impact in refining the model. So that's a big focus in that, because we don't want to just throw everything back at the users and say, hey, is this really, are we on the right track? We want to make sure we select cases that we think are going to bring the most amount of confidence back in the model itself. And of course, data governance and AI governance, as we're producing these documents, as Steve mentioned, and in that final document, even in that chart, here's the source data. Remember that we're actually able to prove provenance all the way back through those steps to the original source that's coming out of that lab information system, or whatever the case may be, and even maybe what user put it in, when it was put in, depending on what's going on. And of course, much of what we talked about, investing more in how we think about our data as knowledge, as opposed to schemas per se, and that will pay dividends. And ultimately, when we want to leverage our data in more sophisticated ways, like incorporating AI into it, we need to be closer to that spot to really get those results that we're seeking. Otherwise, we're not going to.